what was the cause of the tension between the IRD and military intelligence in Northern Ireland? So this kind of, political versus military type of intelligence.
Well, there was conflict between the various organisations. IRD, which was the Foreign Office offshoot, semi-secret, engaged in propaganda, was mostly engaged in kind of political intelligence and disinformation or propaganda. It didn't really want to go to Northern Ireland, but it was kind of forced to in a way because IRD was in decline. It was being cut, it had been cut in 1968, so general numbers were in decline, and Ireland was seen as a possible new place for operations activities, keep the organisation going, etc. It didn't really like the idea of Northern Ireland because it's part of the United Kingdom, and therefore you are engaged in propaganda activities against your own population. This is one of the big debates, and one of the things that people involved with IRD have been trying to kind of cover up for the last 40 years or so, that in fact they were engaged in psychological warfare. This requires a political decision. It requires the political masters to say, okay, you do this, we give you sanction, and yes, you are engaged in propaganda activities against your own population. It's not like being in a foreign country and you do this in some kind of counterinsurgency campaign in the 50s or 60s, where you are engaged in psychological warfare against enemy personnel and against another country. So there are some political difficulties with that. And also I think that the military were more interested in taking it to its limits. They wanted to do things which they'd done in other areas. But Northern Ireland is just too close to the mainland, as it were. And so you have to be very, very careful. I think some of the army activities, besides straightforward briefings of press, etc., were kind of crossing a line and could be potentially disastrous if there was blowback, if they were discovered. But having said that, when you actually look at what IRD did, some of the things that they did were also crossing a line, and you wonder why they did it or how they got away with it. And some of the things were sophisticated, some of them were not. Straightforward kind of propaganda, treating the IRA and particularly the officials as a kind of communist front, which clearly wasn't the case, and ideas about disrupting the organisations. IRD worked very closely with MI6, the Foreign Intelligence Service. And again, MI6 was used to operating abroad. There wasn't much surveillance of what they were doing. Didn't require much cover because nobody was particularly interested in what was going on in some faraway country. But once you get into Northern Ireland, that becomes much more dangerous. MI6 had a Special Operations Unit, the SPA, Special Political Action, which did operate in Northern Ireland, but we know nothing really about what it did. The files don't exist, nobody's really talked about it. But they did work closely with IRD. And IRD were the kind of experts in this area. They had the full backing of the Heath government in the early 1970s, and they used the full range of their activities. Use the press. You brief people on writing articles, you brief people on writing books, you help people to produce books about Northern Ireland, and you kind of frame the debate about what's going on in Northern Ireland, the way that people start to see the provisionals and the IRA and the activities that are taking place. So they are a very important part of what took place in the Troubles in the early 1970s.
The justification for Colin and for Fred is always, oh, we were fighting terrorists, and especially Colin is talking about, well, we didn't want to do all this political stuff that IRD was doing. Obviously, afterwards it went too far, but to me, it just seemed it was oversimplistic to just see everything as a kind of a war against terrorists without accepting that there was this political dimension?
Well, the British had been experts or specialists of this kind of thing in a number of theatres, again in Malaya, Kenya. There were lots. I mean, every year Britain was engaged in some war in some part of the world as part of the declining empire, etc. And IRD were always involved at some level. Whether it was Indonesia, Borneo, they were always there, and they were working very closely with MI6 and also with MI5, who were engaged in security operations, and with the army. You really can't separate them. It would be nice, I think, for some people to think that it was just purely a one-level military operation and that you were just dealing with straightforward terrorists. But that's simply not the case. I mean, MI6 came in 71 because there was a political dimension to it. That's what changed, is the British government realised actually there is a political dimension to this, and they needed MI6, which is responsible for political intelligence, to get involved. And they came from, most of the officers you get in that period come from Africa. They'd been involved in the national movements in Africa, the change from empire to Commonwealth, etc. And those had a propaganda, psychological warfare element. So there isn't this straightforward division between them. It's very clear, though, that there is a kind of mismatch between the army, which does see it as we defeat these terrorists, and we do it militarily, and we can do it militarily. And MI6 IRD say you can't, because if you have, as the IRA did, they had something like 10, 12% of the population who supported them no matter what they did. If they did these terrible bombings, Bloody Friday or whatever, and people got killed, they still had a sizable support amongst the population. And once you have that, you have to have a political dimension. You can't simply do it on a military means. If you think you can do it on a military means, then you have to take on that population as well. And of course, in some ways, that did take place. You could see that things like Bloody Sunday are sending in the paras, who are notorious for being aggressive, to take on the support of the IRA. And they wanted to break it. It backfired, of course, and then became even more political, because that created more support, not only nationally but internationally. And you got American support for the Catholics, the Republican cause, and you then have to deal with that on a psychological, political level. And IRD were involved in countering American support for the IRA, which was very important and substantial, because a lot of the arms that the IRA get after 71 come from America. So this idea of a simple military response actually works against you, because the population becomes antagonistic. They don't like it. Patrolling the streets all the time, houses being invaded, constant surveillance. And you have to say that Northern Ireland was an experiment in lots of ways in the surveillance. It was the most surveyed country in the world. Every citizen probably had a file. Every household was under surveillance, down to minute things like extra pint of milk. Just bought a new TV. Where's the money come from that? Is the milk there because they've got somebody staying there? Is that person staying there a member of the IRA? Everybody becomes under surveillance. And eventually, of course, there's a reaction against this by the population, and they react by supporting, to a certain degree, those people who they think are defending them, which is the IRA in Catholic communities. So it instantly becomes a political problem.
In terms of the kind of Clockwork Orange and the rumours that were spread at that time, Could you just give a short wrap-up of the kind of rumours that were spread about Westminster politicians as part of Clockwork Orange?
Well, we know Clockwork Orange did exist. We've got that documented. Apparently there was Clockwork Orange 1, Clockwork Orange 2, Clockwork Orange 3, Clockwork Orange 4. Clockwork Orange 1 was about a disinformation exercise involving a member of the IRA delivering his kind of autobiography, and within that it had material which was intended to disrupt internally the IRA. Clockwork Orange 2 was a political operation which was designed to undermine certain politicians or collect information about politicians which could be used. And that included a substantial number of politicians from all sides. That included loyalists in Northern Ireland, and I think in some ways this goes to the heart of why there's been such kind of reaction against Colin Wallace, is that what you're looking at is a deliberate operation against a number of Northern Ireland elected politicians. So this is an operation inside the country without, it appears, real political direction. Where it came from is not certain, but it would appear that this is IRD MI5 material, which is collected into profiles of certain politicians, including a number of Labour politicians, some of those who had been involved in campaigns about the Troubles, some Conservative politicians who were kind of not gung-ho about the government policy on Northern Ireland, were sympathetic to the kind of nationalists and the Catholics. This was an attempt to undermine them. The way it was working was to leak material. This is quite a sophisticated operation, really. The British were very good at this. They've been doing it for a long time. I think essentially the foundations of this began during the war, particularly in North America and the United States, with the British Security Coordination, which was the front for MI6. And they set up an operation to attack the isolationists in America and to bring America into the war. And what they did was they set up a number of news agencies, both in the United States and in Europe. They recruited a number of journalists, and they had a committee which drew up ideas, stories that they wanted to put in the press. These would then be given to certain journalists or to a news agency, and they would then be surfaced, as the term is, in Europe, in other news agencies. They would be then transferred back to the United States and offered as stories to newspapers. Some of those newspapers had a very close relationship with MI6. They would then go back to the MI6 source and ask about this particular story and say, is it legitimate? And you get things like an intelligence source says, yes, this is true. And the idea is, at no point can you actually pinpoint who the original source is. That the original source, which is, say, the MI6, doesn't leave a trace. And gradually this gets into the media. Besides the newspapers and the journalists, there are also people who spread rumours. And there were quite a large number of people whose job it was just to sit in bars, coffee bars, talk to people, go to clubs and spread rumours. And gradually kind of build up this idea about someone or some operation. And so this is kind of thing that Colin was doing and Clockwork Orange was about. That you spread these rumours, And a place like the House of Commons, amongst the MPs, are rumour mongering all the time, gossiping. It's a very self-enclosed world, and they talk about each other. You give it to certain journalists. We know some of the journalists who were running these smears. They appear in newspapers. Then it kind of spreads, so you get one story about one particular person, and gradually other newspapers take it up, and you feed into that other material. These can be both short-term and long-term. So on a short-term basis, you might have a particular smear. It might be that, say, Paisley was in receipt of some money from an American source. Where was that money? Why did he get it? What did he do with it? Is Paisley corrupt? Did he know certain people who turn out to be homosexual? Can you kind of tar Paisley with the same thing? Another might be, say, is Merlin Rees soft on IRA prisoners? The army thinks we can win the war militarily in Belfast, which maybe they could. But Merlin Rees, as the Northern Ireland Secretary, is too soft. He's holding us back. He's released some prisoners. They shouldn't have been released. They are now engaged in terrorism again. None of it may be true, but you can get it into the press, and the press pick it up and they start asking questions. It puts Rees on the back foot. You get some Tory MPs to demand tougher action against the IRA, support the military, etc. So these are sophisticated campaigns, and Colin was very good at it. And there were a lot of journalists willing to take the stories, which is one of the reasons why Colin is an embarrassment, and why some journalists have kind of refused to back him or talk about it, because they took the stories. They ran them. Did they know that they were true or untrue? If it's a good enough story, they'll probably run it. So there were key politicians who were targeted, and they would run from all kinds of smears: sexual smears, financial smears, being too close to kind of the IRA, and that would be by means of somebody spoke at a conference about republicanism, or in some cases they forged documents. So you add a name to a particular letter that's been sent out in support of Republican cause. And then you can get people to ask questions about, are they really patriotic? Are they supporting the military? Are they militant enough against the IRA, etc.? And MI5 have been doing this for a long time. This is a kind of disruptive action that had been taking place in other places. So it's not surprising. There is still a lot about this that we don't know. And when Colin has delivered the notes, and we know who was involved as targets, etc., we don't know as yet who the particular officers were. We know their names, we know maybe what they looked like, but we don't really know who it was, whether and if it really was MI5. Some of the documents are very, very similar to the makeup and design of IRD documents, and so there's an assumption that they come from IRD. Other documents have appeared in other places. A particular Times journalist in 1974 received a batch of documents which are very, very similar. Stories did appear in the press. So there is a thing about whether Clockwork Orange went forward and was operational, and that some of these stories did appear in the press, or whether at some stage it was kind of cut off. But we do know it existed.
In terms of kind of sitting in pubs and spreading rumours, I mean, was this in Northern Ireland or was this also in the UK? And where did you hear that information? Because I'd never heard that before. That was kind of one of the ways that they...
We know the biography of an MI5 officer called John Bingham, he actually talks about it, that he went to Northern Ireland and he sat in bars in Belfast, both to pick up information and to kind of spread things. And I've picked it up following that in other places. I know that there were other people that did this. I mean, it was quite banal, quite simple. You just go into a bar, you talk to people, and all the rest of it. But some of these people are doing it a long time. John Bingham goes back to the 1930s, and he was involved in informing on the British Union of Fascists and Mosley. And he did all kinds of things. But one of them, yes, was to go into bars. You listen to conversations, you go into Republican areas or Loyalist areas, listen to what people are talking about. And as part of that, you can do these kind of rumours as well. It is one of the areas that is so under-researched. In the period 1938, 1939, Britain had a very sophisticated system whereby there were scores of people around the country who picked up material from things like bars, clubs, etc., and reported them to a central source. And this developed at the beginning of the Second World War, when there was a fear that the Germans might invade, that there would be this system of local reporting by, the man in the streets. It might be a doctor, somebody who would be picking up reports about support for the Germans, or the war wasn't going well, and those kind of things. This wasn't about mass observation. This was intelligence reporting. And one wonders what happened after the war, because it seems to just disappear. But they did these kind of things, and there was a very sophisticated rumour system which extended in this country, particular places like ports, aerodromes, and also into foreign countries. I know that there were people in Istanbul in bars and things who used to listen to things, but also they were there to spread rumours. And I suspect this is also what happened in Northern Ireland. No, one or two specific instances where this happened, and I suspect it's probably wider. Yeah, I think you can pick up a lot in bars. A few drinks, people start talking, and they probably will talk more than they would in other situations. And if it's a local bar, then it's things like, where's Paddy gone? Oh, he went over the border or something, haven't seen so-and-so for some time, or, somebody disappeared. And it's small things. You see, but in Northern Ireland, when they began in 69 and 70, the intelligence was really poor. There was the RUC, but they weren't reliable. Their intelligence gathering was very poor. The military did not trust them. MI5 did not trust them. So the military reluctantly decided they would have to set up their own intelligence gathering system. But how do you do that? What they did was gather minute intelligence on a mass scale. So every soldier, in effect, became an intelligence officer. They would collect small-scale information. So if you are on patrol down the street, you would be looking out, again, things like how many bottles of milk. Has somebody decorated their house? Where did the money come from? Because you're talking about, particularly in the working class areas, these were really, really poor areas. The soldiers who went in, British soldiers, English soldiers, working class, they were shocked. They could not believe the conditions that they would go into. And some of them were appalled by what they did, because they were, breaking down doors, going into houses, looking for arms. And they would see people living in absolute poverty. So if somebody got a TV, that is a big thing. Where does the money come from? And so what they did was they would report these very small things. It would be gathered, it would then be built on, and they would develop these profiles of the street, of the inhabitants, of the houses, and this would go into a bigger intelligence system. In late 73 and into 74, computers started to come in. Peter Wright went to Belfast, the MI5 officer, and with a guy called Jack Morton, and they set up a much more sophisticated intelligence analysis. They were using computers for the very first time. And it was all this small-scale material that went into it. The Army built up their own parallel intelligence gathering system because, again, they just simply did not trust the RUC. And for a time, they didn't trust MI6 or MI5, and they had to do it themselves. This goes counter to normal counterintelligence policy, where what you do is you set up a special branch. They are the people who gather intelligence on the ground. That is delivered to the army, and then they carry out the operations. This is probably where the idea comes from that the military are kind of above the political process, because all they do is carry out the operations. But in Northern Ireland, they couldn't do that because the intelligence system wasn't in place to enable them to do that. They had to take on board intelligence gathering, but also things like hearts and minds policy, getting engaged with the community. And again, as soon as you get engaged with the community, you are into politics.
What about the rumours about kind of Westminster politicians, like spreading rumours about Harold Wilson and his connection with the Communist Party and things like that, which you covered in your book? Could you talk a little bit about, those kind of rumours, like the financial scandals, rumours about communism, and why that was important in terms of what Colin was doing? I mean, why do you think Colin had that information?
Well, there is a kind of change you get in late 73 and into 74 about what IRD are doing, what about MI5 and MI6. I think there's a view that the war against the IRA can be won, but it requires a much stiffer response from the politicians. That there is a case that the military can beat the IRA, particularly in Belfast. And if you look at it in detail, it's very, very clear that by late 74, the IRA were nearly beaten. They were on their last legs, particularly in Belfast. The penetration of the IRA in terms of one particular agent, it was being wrapped up. Most of the leaders were in prison. They didn't have very much left on the ground to carry out operations. And there was certainly a view in the military that it was kind of one more push and we defeat them in Belfast and then we can defeat them everywhere else. But the army increasingly was the view that the politicians were not giving them full backing. And so there is this move to go at the politicians. At the same time, MI5 are engaged in that same kind of process. They come in 74, in about August of 74, they take over as the lead agency in terms of intelligence gathering, and they are much more hardline. They are of the view, like the military, that we can defeat them. In one level, it's kind of true, but at another level, that kind of misinterprets the whole thing. That you may defeat them in Belfast, but what you do by Omagh, where they never defeated them. So two lines of kind of propaganda come together. There is the Northern Ireland, which is about the politicians not being good enough, and also in one instance on the loyalist side, it is that some of the loyalist politicians, Paisley, etc., are too close to their own terrorist groups, and they want to undermine them. But at the same stage, on the mainland, there is the MI5. It's not completely MI5. It's a very... Well, David Sterling once told us, myself and a colleague, that if you want to understand the Wilson plots, then you have to see it in terms of a few members in MI5, a few members in MI6, and retired members of both who come together in a group and have decided enough is enough. They don't like Heath, they think he is too soft, and they think Wilson is a communist. Now, I did speak to one of them, one of the lead people in this, and I said, did you really believe Wilson was a communist? And he said, no. It was a line we used. This is the kind of thing they'd done in other places. But they knew that that kind of line could work and could be successful. And Wilson, and also Tony Benn, probably suffered the worst media propaganda campaign that any politician has ever suffered. Far more than, say, Jeremy Corbyn. Because this was smears on a personal, political, social level. It was smears about sex, accusations that Wilson had affairs, that Tony Benn had affairs, financial, that Wilson was corrupt, that he had secret bank accounts, and we know now that forgeries were involved in that, and other politicians such as Ted Short was accused of having secret bank accounts as well. That Wilson was corrupt, he was engaged in various dodgy deals, slag heaps, etc. That he was having an affair with Marcia Faulkner, but also others. You know, it also involved Ted Heath, that he was homosexual, that he was engaged in all kinds of practices, and this is where some of the things which would come up 20 years later, 30 years later, originate. And they would use anything, basically, to have a go at them. This has been building up for a decade. Some of it was material that had been given to some MI5 officers by the CIA, in particular James Angleton, which was based around the alleged information from Soviet defectors. That Wilson was too close to the KGB, that his predecessor in the Labour Party had been assassinated, and Wilson's way had been eased into the leadership. There were accusations about, which is again kind of interesting in retrospect, about him being too close to Jewish people, that his private office was funded by Jewish businessmen, which was true because at that particular stage there was no direct funding of the opposition's office. So there were kind of anti-Semitic smears. And there were certainly some very personal smears. And this material was given to journalists. It was floated in America through particular news agencies on the extreme right, with the idea that it would be picked up by British journalists. They were being signposted where to look. One particular way of doing this is a few years ago, the son of a MI6 officer contacted me and said, you've written about my father, but did you know that when he retired in 1970, he went into the City of London and he started a newsletter, and he worked with a particular MI6 officer who was retired, George Kennedy Young, and spread rumours through this newsletter and smears about Wilson. And so there was fairly sophisticated, there was again these kind of rumour networks which were picked up, and some of this would then be picked up by journalists. And somebody like Colin, who was given this material by this MI5 person, could back it up with documents, with more information that he'd been given. This is the point when Colin starts to question, what is he being asked to do? What has this got to do with Northern Ireland? What has this got to do with the battle with the IRA? And why are we being asked to do something which is clearly political and who is giving the political okay for this. Colin is a very stickler to the rules. It's a bureaucratic process. An officer tells you to do this, I'll do it. Somebody gives you the okay to do this. Is there a written document to say I can do this? Okay, I'll do it. This is what you want. I don't quite clearly understand all of what you're doing, but yeah, I'll carry out that order. And then suddenly he's getting material which doesn't go through that same kind of process, that it seems to bypass the normal channels. And suddenly he's getting all this material which has clearly been well planned, well thought out, contains a lot of information that is secret, and he's been asked to distribute it. And so he questions it. And that's when all his troubles start.
I was wondering about the targeting of politicians. I mean, what was the aim? Was it to kind of send a signal to the politicians to say, well, maybe you should change your behaviour and what you do, or was it to try and undermine the politician or the government?
Both, I think. There were clearly different aims. We can't be certain about kind of what level this was happening at. There was certainly use of material to undermine people. Sorry. There was certainly use of material to undermine people, destabilise them. I think Paisley is a good example in lots of ways, in that he was a major force in Northern Ireland, and a force which clearly wasn't for the good, that he had himself very good sources inside the army and amongst other groups. And he was told about some of the things that were going on. He was very clearly worried about the attempts against him. Clearly they wanted to undermine him. His position in Northern Ireland, I mean, he could, if he wanted to he could bring out the loyalist groups onto the streets. They would kind of follow his directions, and he was a threat. So on one level you can understand it, but again, this is he is an elected politician. And this is a psychological warfare campaign against an elected politician. So from whatever side he's on, it is wrong and unlawful. Others were, in a way, being undermined to control. That, look, if you go that way, we're going to release this. We know you did this. This is not a good thing to do. You keep on with that policy, or you do that, or you're in trouble. Get rid of certain politicians, that they are seen as a threat. But outside of that, there is this group, again, this kind of few intelligence officers, both in MI5 and MI6, and those that are outside of it, and, it's the old saying, you never leave the service, even if you have retired. And some politicians on the right who were former intelligence officers themselves. Their view was basically to bring down Wilson. They were anti-Labour, anti-Wilson. They also thought that Heath himself was soft, that he should have been taking on the trade unions. He should have been taking on the miners. They were appalled by the election in February 74, which Heath lost on the basis of who rules the country. There is, from this viewpoint, it looks very odd, but you have to kind of get yourself into the mindset of 73 and 74. For a number of politicians, for a number of intelligence officers, and for people in the city who were very important, this looked like the apocalypse. They genuinely thought the whole thing was going to come down. In particular, the oil crisis. This was a real crisis of capitalism. And you saw the head of the CBI talking about the end of kind of capitalism as we know it. And then you have somebody like Wilson, and Labour Party, even though he's a very moderate kind of socialist, the idea of the socialists coming in and kind of instigating what they saw as being kind of a Kremlin-backed government, that meant they were willing to do anything. And some of them were. And they ran these campaigns. And they were trying to get some of the material that was in MI5, in Northern Ireland, to use against them. I think one of the reasons why they used Northern Ireland was, again, it's going back to their experience of how you do this. You kind of do it through a third country. You don't do it direct. You don't do it in England. You do it in Northern Ireland. It's a bit out, and you kind of pass it to another group, and they pass it to another group. So the origin of this becomes much more obscure. But you can trace a lot of these stories, as we did years ago. You take some of the things that are in Clockwork Orange, you go back to the press, and you can see some of them do surface. And if you look at something like Chapman Pincher and the material that is in his books from that particular period, or when he's looking at that particular period, some of these stories, smears are in there. So it's not as if the material that was produced in Northern Ireland simply disappears. It finds its way into the media and into the system. And it's a kind of gradual thing. Things about vetting of politicians was Marcia Faulkner Wilson's prime kind of supporter and helper. Was she properly vetted? And then you can see how this appears in the press. Certain politicians ask questions. And some of this was dealt with people like Barry Penrose, Brian Courtier in the Pencourt file. At the time, they didn't really have a clue. And if you ask them about certain things, they say, look, we didn't know how the intelligence services operated. We didn't know who was the head, didn't know who they were. So it was all kind of researching in the dark. Because that's where Wallace is so important. That's why he's such an important whistleblower, is he had the documents. He knew how it worked. He knew the journalists. He'd spoken to them. He delivered it. He knew the process. He knew what was going on. And one of the kind of real shocks in terms of Wallace and his story is that we now know that Wilson in 1977, 76 actually mentioned Wallace. Somehow Wallace's story had got to Wilson. All this stuff about attempts to destabilise, that they were running campaigns through Northern Ireland, he knew. And of course, Wilson himself comes under attack as being a Walter Mitty character, as being paranoid. But he was actually quite sophisticated. He knew a lot of this stuff. People were telling him things. And of course, we now know in retrospect that the Cabinet Secretary himself, if we can't trust the Cabinet Secretary, who can we? When the Cabinet Secretary says there was a campaign and it was run by kind of dissident section in MI5, basically Peter Wright and one or two others, and by George Kennedy Young, former Deputy Chief of MI6, I would take his word against any others.
Maybe just a quick comment about whether Clockwork Orange, targeting politicians, whether that actually had any effect. Because one of the things Rory Cormack says that it may have happened, but it didn't have an effect. And Colin was also saying it didn't. What he's saying is that not that it's had an effect, but that it shouldn't have been done. So I was just wondering what your opinion on that was.
Right. Okay. Things like Clockwork Orange, there's a bit of debate about whether it took place, which I think we can now say it did. We have enough documentary evidence to say that the campaign actually existed. Did it actually go into operation? That's more debatable. but I certainly think elements of it did, because we can trace the articles that then appeared and some of the smears that were talked about. We know that some of the politicians knew about certain elements of it. Did it really have an effect? That's much more difficult. Because I think it works on two levels. One is the immediacy of it. If you launch a smear, and does it work and does it affect people? And secondly, there's a longer term one, which I think is probably in the end the more important one. What's the effect over a longer period? On the first one, in terms of the immediacy, I think it's very clear that some elements of it did take place, they were launched, and they have an effect. Because certain politicians, and I can think of people like Judith Hart, lost their jobs, that they were sidelined, that once you start to undermine people's security, or the idea that they are secure, that they can be trusted, then you get the state apparatus, MI5, etc., come in and say, well, I'm sorry, Prime Minister, we're not sure about this particular minister because they've been seen with so-and-so. They made telephone calls to the Communist Party headquarters. Are they potentially a security risk? It's kind of not take a chance. So it's up to a Prime Minister, whether strong or not, to say, sorry, I don't believe you. Sometimes Wilson did say that, and he kept certain people, but there were other people who were demoted and lost jobs. So you can say that to a certain level it did work. And it kind of undermines, I think, the position of people. Merlin Rees, I think, probably wasn't the greatest politician in the world, but I think his position was partly undermined by the briefings against him. Whether that was part of Clockwork Orange or not, his position with regard to the army in Northern Ireland was undermined, and there was an element of mistrust between them. And you can read material from Rees, and he knows what's going on. And they had, certain elements in the army had no respect for him. So there are parts of it that do work, and Ted Short, he was undermined. And you get people like Tony Benn. I mean, the campaign against Tony Benn is ridiculous. It's constant. It's, Ben getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning because he can hear noise outside, and he sees that there are people going through his bins looking for material. And his telephones are tapped. There are stories in the press, some of them verging on the insane, that he was engaged in sexual orgies. That he was linked to all kinds of communist groups, etc. I think they have an effect, because we began to see Ben as this loony character. And I think it's the long-term effect that's important. That over time, this trickle has an effect. It shapes the way that we see people. Wilson was seen as this Walter Mitty character. Paranoid, could not be trusted. You still see it. There are still people write accounts and say he was paranoid about what was going on. And he wasn't. He knew what was going on. People were telling him this stuff. The cabinet secretary was telling him. The head of MI6 was telling him. And people were coming to him with material about actual smears being planted and all that kind of thing. But it does shape our view of Wilson and others. And I think this is the way it works now, is over time this drip effect shapes the way that we see people like Corbyn. He may not be a great politician, and I don't think he is, but the electorate's view of Corbyn has been shaped by this continual drip feed of smears, disinformation, and it's lapped up. And It works. It's the old adage which Colin always says, you know, if you tell a big enough lie, it comes from Goebbels, if you tell a big enough lie, you get it in there, it sticks. It doesn't matter how much effort you try to stop it or come back on it, the original smear sticks. And it's done so through Wilson and others.
When you were teaching, I know you said that you're not teaching anymore now, but you were before. It was journalism, wasn't it? Now, did you ever address interaction with intelligence services in your kind of courses?
One of my main areas of interest is the relationship between intelligence and journalism. And I'm working towards a book on MI6 and intelligence. And there have been bits and pieces I've done before, and I've done pieces, and there are a number of academics who have written pieces. But I don't think anybody really has got to grips with this and understands how big it is. That if you look in the post-war period, there are scores of journalists who worked in intelligence during the war. Not every one of them continued with that relationship, but quite a few did. And we know from the files that George Blake, MI6 officer, gave to the KGB, and he gave them lists of dozens of journalists who were seen as sources by MI6. There was a close relationship with some journalists. They were recruited as direct agents. There were journalists who were friendly to the service. There were journalists who actually were intelligence officers who used journalism as a cover. There were news agencies that were fronts, or for a time Reuters, for instance, was used by MI6. So this relationship was very extensive. You can see it also in authors. There are some books which were MI6 reports that came out as books. Some authors were given material to put in their books. It sounds bizarre, but it took place. And this relationship in the Cold War in particular is just very under-researched. But it's very, very close. Quite where it went or where it goes is very difficult to address, but you can clearly follow some stories, some ideas which were put in there by the intelligence services. This idea of kind of, you know, fake news, etc., is not a new idea. The difference, of course, is the internet. It makes it much more easier. The press secretary at the time was Suez under Eden in 1956, when Eden lied about the secret relationship between Britain, France and the UK over the invasion. His press secretary said, having considered this, I've concluded that you can fool all of the people all of the time. You can do it. And I think the internet makes that easier. You know, somebody like Colin, if he had the internet, God, his job would be so easy. Float ideas, obscure websites, get it picked up, goes to another one, it becomes legitimate news. Who's the source? Where does it come from? People believe it. It's much more sophisticated, much more difficult in his day to do it, but it did take place. Colin is important again because he illustrates how this works and how it worked. He wasn't the only one doing this. There were other areas that was doing this, and you know, MI6 employed quite a few people to deal with the press. They weren't simply dealing with inquiries. The media was very important in intelligence operations. I once got heavily criticised by someone in the academic world, said, but some of your stuff comes out of the press. And I said, yes, because that's where they operate. That's where some of the intelligence services operated. They ran their operations through this because they planted material. They used the press to disrupt groups, plant rumours about internal dissension, about people who talk. You create paranoia. You try and suggest that this group is, paranoid breaking up, and it works. And you come across this so often. So the study of the press in terms of intelligence is an important area. It's very under-researched.
And in terms of advice to your former students, would you say to them, yes, as a journalist, perhaps if you are approached by the intelligence services, it's a good idea to cooperate, or do you say it's better perhaps if you keep your own integrity, or what would you say?
Well, I've just reviewed a book by Richard Taylor, who's the Guardian journalist. He had one of the closest relationships with intelligence services in Fleet Street. And there were people always saying, oh, he's run by the intelligence services, etc. I have absolutely no evidence of that. He was a journalist with integrity, but he had sources at the highest level. One of the problems with British journalism is there are very few journalists with sources at the highest level. You can see American journalists, say somebody like Seymour Hersh. He can talk to somebody in the Defense Department, the CIA, and they will talk to him and he will get information. He's not being run by them. This is what a journalist should be doing. And it's the same with Richard Taylor. He was very critical of what they did. But he would seek information. He could talk to the people. The majority of British journalists, they haven't got these sources at all. If they do have the sources, they are being run. Because it's so unusual in Britain, with its ultra-secrecy, that the relationship with an intelligence services is always a one-way street. It is always the intelligence services running you. Because the British system of journalism is fairly unique in the world. It is 12 national newspapers, whatever, over 100 years, the same newspapers, fighting for the same circulation. It's not like Germany, United States, where you have newspapers for a city. Here it's all dog eat dog. They want the story. So if an intelligence service feeds them a good story, they'll run it. Will they check it? Probably not. Will they have 3 sources? No. Will they have 2 sources? No. Will they have 1 source? Maybe. But that source will almost certainly be the intelligence services that gave them the story in the first place. So our knowledge of the intelligence services has very, very recently been very, very poor. It's been a one-way street again. It's the Chapman pinchers. E.P. Thompson said he was the sewer of Fleet Street because he took all these stories. He did have very good sources, but they weren't actually intelligence. They were mostly Department of Defense. There are very few journalists I could name who could actually do a story about, say, torture, because they simply do not have the sources that would actually give them reliable information. So I always tell students, you have to keep your integrity. And one of the reasons for that is that this connection, this relationship between journalism and intelligence has been so damaging. And people lose lives because there used to be very clear foreign correspondence, intelligence. The host country saw the foreign correspondent as a foreign correspondent. They no longer see that. Terrorist groups see journalists as being intelligence sources because over a period that relationship between intelligence and journalism got too close. Too many journalists relied on what the intelligence services told them. There were too many journalists who were agents, and some, again, were actually posing as journalists and used journalism as a cover. That has completely undermined the independence of journalism. And it is very understandable. If you were a nationalist liberation terrorist group in the Middle East and journalists appear, start asking questions, why would I trust them? You know, who are they working for? Is it the CIA? Is it MI6? There's a very good story, Jeffrey Wheatcroft. George Kennedy Young was the deputy chief of MI6, and he went into I think it was the office of Spectator magazine, and according to Wheatcroft, he pointed at the journalist. He said, "I know who's running you, I know who's running you, and I know who's running you, but Jeffrey, I don't know who's running you." You know, when you get to that kind of level, why would you trust any relationship with the intelligence services? It's corrupting.